She was just supposed to clean his bathroom. That was the job. Mop the floors, scrub the tiles, disappear before he noticed she existed. But Choi Tae-yoon noticed everything. He always did. That was how he'd built an empire on blood and silence. And the moment he stepped through that bathroom door and found her standing there, something cracked open inside his chest that no amount of power had ever been able to touch. He leaned against the doorframe, eyes dark, voice low, and whispered those words that changed everything. "Shower with me. You will love it. Welcome, fam. Please like, share, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from." Her name was Amara. Amara Osei. 26 years old, from Accra, Ghana. Now standing in Seoul, South Korea, in the marble bathroom of a man whose name was spoken in hushed, terrified voices across 3 continents. She had full lips, deep brown skin that glowed like polished mahogany, and curves that she had spent years learning to carry with quiet dignity. Her eyes were her best feature, wide and warm and honest, the kind of eyes that could not lie even when the rest of her face tried to. She had come to Seoul on a work visa through a domestic staffing agency. The job posting had said live-in housekeeping for a private residence. It had not said anything about the residence being a fortress. It had not said anything about the man who owned it. Choi Tae-yoon was 34 years old, and he controlled the Choi Syndicate, the most feared criminal organization in Seoul. He was tall for a Korean man, broad across the shoulders, with hands that were elegant and dangerous in equal measure. His face was the kind of beautiful that confused people, sharp jaw, full mouth, heavy-lidded eyes that were almost black in low light. He wore expensive things carelessly, the way people who have never had to think about money move through the world.
He spoke rarely.
He smiled almost never. And the few people who had ever seen genuine emotion cross his face had been smart enough not to mention it afterward. Amara's first week in the Choi estate passed without incident. She learned the rhythms of the house quickly because she was smart and because her survival depended on it. The estate sat in the hills above Gangnam, a compound really 3 buildings connected by glass walkways, surrounded by walls and cameras and silent men in dark suits who watched everything. There were 6 other domestic staff. They were polite but cautious. They did not talk about the boss. They did not look directly at him when he passed through a room. They had perfected the art of becoming invisible, and they expected Amara to do the same. She tried. She really did. The problem was that Choi Tae-yoon kept finding her. Not deliberately. Or at least she told herself it was not deliberate. He passed through the kitchen at 6 in the morning when she was preparing the household breakfast. He walked through the east garden at dusk when she was trimming the hedges. He appeared in the library doorway when she was dusting the shelves, and he stood there long enough that she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure before she turned around and found him watching her with an expression she could not name. He never said anything. He just watched. By the end of the first week, Amara's nerves were frayed and pulled tight. She was not afraid of him exactly. She was afraid of the way he made her feel, like she was the only solid thing in a room that was slowly tipping sideways. The morning everything changed started like any other. Amara arrived at the master suite at 7 a.m. with her cleaning cart because that was her assigned schedule on Tuesdays and Fridays. She knocked 3 times, which was protocol. No response. She knocked again, waited, then used the master key the housekeeper had given her and stepped inside. The suite was empty. The bed was already made, pulled tight as a military bunk, and the curtains were drawn back to let in the pale morning light. Amara moved through the space quickly and efficiently, straightening what little needed straightening because Choi Tae-yoon was apparently the kind of man who barely disturbed his own environment. She moved into the bathroom, and that was where she made her mistake. She started singing. It was a habit she could not break. Whenever she cleaned alone, she hummed or sang low under her breath, old songs her grandmother had taught her, Ghanaian folk melodies that had no lyrics in English but carried everything in the melody itself. She was singing now, scrubbing the base of the enormous marble shower, the water running hot from the faucet she'd turned on to rinse the cleaning solution, steam rising around her, and she did not hear the suite door open behind her. She did not hear his footsteps. What she heard was his voice. "What are you singing?" She spun around so fast, she knocked the cleaning bucket sideways and grabbed the shower wall to keep from falling. He was standing in the bathroom doorway in a dark dress shirt that was not yet buttoned, his collar open, and his hair still damp from what must have been an earlier workout because she could see the tension across his shoulders, the controlled restlessness in his posture. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she could not name, but now it was closer, more concentrated, like a lens-focusing light. "I am sorry," she said immediately, reaching to turn off the faucet. "I did not know you were here. I knocked. I waited. I thought the room was—" He held up one hand, and she stopped speaking mid-sentence. "What were you singing?" he repeated. His voice was not loud. It was never loud. That was the most unsettling thing about him, the quietness of his authority. She had heard the other staff describe how he handled disagreements, how he never raised his voice, how the lower and quieter he got the more dangerous the room became. Right now his voice was very, very quiet. "It is a Ghanaian folk song," Amara said carefully. "My grandmother used to sing it. I apologize. I was not aware you could hear me from the—" He was not looking at her face anymore. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her all week, that slow, thorough, unreadable study, as though she were something he was trying to figure out and was irritated that he had not managed it yet. The steam from the shower was still curling between them. The room smelled like cedar wood and her cleaning supplies and something she could not identify, something warm and expensive that she realized was just him. She became suddenly, acutely aware of how small the bathroom was. He stepped inside. Her heartbeat did something complicated. He moved past her to the mirror, reached past her shoulder to turn the faucet off himself, and in doing so came close enough that she could have counted his eyelashes. She held very still. He smelled like cedarwood and black coffee and danger. "You have a beautiful voice," he said. He said it the same way he might have said the weather is cold today. Flat. Factual. Like it was information he was simply delivering rather than a compliment. Amara did not know what to do with that. She said thank you and started gathering her cleaning supplies. He watched her for another long moment. Then, as she turned toward the door, he said it. The words that would fracture the careful, professional distance she had been building between them all week. "Shower with me. You will love it." The words landed in the space between them like a stone dropping into still water. She turned back to face him slowly. His expression had not changed. His eyes were steady on hers, dark and waiting, and she realized with a jolt of something electric and terrifying that he was serious. Not aggressive. Not leering. Serious. Like he had considered it and decided it was a reasonable suggestion and was simply waiting for her to agree. "What?" she said. The word came out barely above a whisper. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more private than a smile. A slight softening of an expression that almost never softened. "You heard me," he said. Amara picked up her cleaning bucket. She looked him directly in the eye. She said, with complete composure, "I am your housekeeper, Mr. Choi. I do not shower with employers." And then she walked out of the bathroom and through the suite and down the hallway and did not stop until she had put 3 floors between herself and his bathroom and his voice and that expression on his face that she was already, helplessly, replaying. She told herself she was angry. She was not angry. She was something else entirely. Something she had no interest in examining. Later that day she was called to the head housekeeper's office. Mrs. Park was a small, precise woman in her 60s who had worked for the Choi family for 20 years and whose loyalty to the syndicate was absolute and slightly alarming. "The boss has requested a change in your assignment," Mrs. Park said, without looking up from her desk. Amara felt her stomach drop. "You will no longer clean the master suite," Mrs. Park continued. "You have been reassigned to the boss's personal attendant rotation. His meals, his schedule, his private requests. You will be available 7 days a week from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Your salary has been doubled." Amara sat very still. "He doubled my salary," she said slowly. Mrs. Park looked up for the first time. Her expression was not unkind. It was careful, like she was measuring every word before she released it. "The boss has very particular preferences," she said. "And he rarely takes interest in the domestic staff." She paused. "You should consider this an elevation, not an imposition." Amara considered it. She considered the doubled salary. She considered the debt her younger brother owed on his university tuition back in Accra. She considered the medical bills her mother was still managing on a nurse's salary. She considered none of those things were going to pay themselves. She accepted the reassignment. The following morning, she reported to the boss's private dining room at 6 a.m. with his breakfast. Black coffee, no sugar, 2 soft-boiled eggs, and a single slice of toasted sourdough. Mrs. Park had drilled the order into her like a military briefing. He does not like anything changed. He does not like conversation with his morning coffee. He reads. You serve. You leave. Amara could do that. Except he was already at the table when she arrived, sitting with his phone face down in front of him and his eyes on the door. He had been waiting, watching for her. She set the tray down. She poured the coffee. She turned to leave. You don't eat breakfast, he said. It was not a question. She turned back. I eat in the staff kitchen, Mr. Choi. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and said nothing else. She left. In the hallway, she stood against the wall for 10 full seconds with her eyes closed and told herself she was perfectly fine and nothing about this job was going to be a problem. She was already lying to herself, and they both knew it. A few days later, the problem had a name, and the name was Kang Dae-young. He was one of Tae-yoon's senior lieutenants, a man who wore his authority loudly in the way Tae-yoon wore his quietly, all noise and performance where Tae-yoon was silence and certainty. He arrived at the estate on a Thursday afternoon for a meeting that Amara was not supposed to know the details of, and she would have remained completely ignorant of it, except that he found her in the corridor outside the meeting room collecting used tea trays. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely different from the one she had learned to be careful around. His was easy to read. It was the kind of look that assumed permission had already been granted. You must be the new one, he said in accented English. He spoke English the way some men did, like it was a performance they were putting on for her specifically. You are quite beautiful. Amara kept her eyes on the tray. Thank you, she said, stepping to move past him. He stepped with her. His hand reached out and touched her arm. Just her forearm. Fingers closing gently but with the casual entitlement of a man who had never been told no by a woman who worked in someone else's house. She went very still. What is your name? He said. She opened her mouth to answer. The door to the meeting room opened. Choi Tae-yoon stood in the doorway. He had clearly heard everything. He looked first at Amara, and something in his expression shifted, something fast and volcanic that was gone almost before it appeared. Then he looked at Kang Dae-young. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He said in Korean quietly, "Take your hand off her." The temperature in the corridor dropped several degrees. Kang Dae-young released Amara's arm so quickly it would have been almost funny under different circumstances. He stepped back. He straightened. He looked at Tae-yoon with an expression that was suddenly very different, careful, assessing, alarmed. She works for you, Dae-young said carefully. I did not know. Tae-yoon's eyes stayed on him. Now you do. He looked at Amara. Go to the kitchen. Mrs. Park will have your next assignment. She went. She did not look back. But she heard him, very clearly, as she turned the corner, addressing Kang Dae-young in a voice so low and controlled it made the hair on her arms rise. If you touch her again, I will remove the hand that touched her. This is a one-time courtesy. There will not be a second one. Amara stood in the kitchen with her back against the cold industrial refrigerator and tried to decide what she was feeling. Grateful. She was grateful. She was also something else. Something that sat in her chest like an ember. Warm and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. That evening, after the household had settled into its nighttime quiet, there was a knock at her bedroom door. Her room was in the staff wing, small and clean and hers, and she had decorated it with a photograph of her family and a small Kent cloth her grandmother had sent with her when she left Accra. She opened the door. A junior staff member stood there holding a white box. Amara looked at the box. She looked at the staff member. From the boss, the young woman said, then disappeared quickly. Amara brought the box inside and sat on the edge of her bed for a full minute before opening it. Inside was a pair of slippers. Not cheap ones. The kind that were lined with cashmere and made by someone who understood comfort as an art form. Underneath them was a short note in handwriting that was precise and spare as everything else about him. The floors in the staff wing are cold. Wear these. That was all. No signature. He had not even signed it. Amara sat with the slippers in her lap for a very long time. She was in serious trouble and she knew it. The slippers were just the beginning. Amara wore them because they were warm and because she was practical and because she told herself a gift from an employer meant nothing beyond basic human decency. She told herself this every morning when she put them on. She almost believed it by the end of the first week. The gifts did not stop. There was a heating pad for her lower back because he had apparently noticed, in the utterly unsettling way he noticed everything, that she pressed her hand against her lower back when she had been standing too long. There was a small humidifier for her bedroom because the staff wing was dry in winter and she had developed a cough that she was trying to manage quietly. There was a bottle of shea butter from a Ghanaian brand she had been trying to find in Seoul and had mentioned, once, in passing to Mrs. Park, thinking the conversation was entirely private. Nothing in this house was private from Choi Tae-yoon. He delivered none of these things himself. They appeared outside her door with no ceremony and no explanation, just the quiet certainty of a man who had decided something and was executing it without fanfare. Amara found that more unsettling than grand gestures would have been. Grand gestures she could have dismissed. This was different. This was attention. This was a man who watched closely and then acted on what he saw, which meant he was watching her closely enough to see things she had not even said out loud. She started being more careful. She controlled her expressions when he was near. She kept her posture professional and her eyes forward and her interactions brief and transactional, the way Mrs. Park had described the ideal staff member. Invisible, efficient, present without being present. He noticed that too. She knew he noticed because the Tuesday after she started her new careful strategy, he appeared in the private kitchen while she was preparing his lunch, and he stood with his arms folded and his shoulder against the doorframe and said, without preamble, "You have changed." Amara did not look up from the soup she was stirring. "I am not sure what you mean, Mr. Choi."
"You are trying not to look at me."
She looked at him then, which was perhaps exactly what he intended. His expression was not triumphant. It was watchful, serious, like this was information he needed and was collecting methodically. "I am focused on my work," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen, pulled out a stool at the island, and sat down as though he were planning to stay. He had never done this before. He had never eaten in the kitchen. He ate in his private dining room at the table she set every morning. "What are you making?" he said. She blinked. "Groundnut soup," she said slowly. "It is a Ghanaian dish. I had ingredients left from the market run, and I thought." She stopped. She had been about to explain that she made it for herself on her breaks, not for him, but the look on his face made her hesitate. He was not looking at the soup. He was looking at her hands. The way a person looked at something they found beautiful and were trying to memorize. She turned back to the stove. "It is ready in 20 minutes, she said carefully. "If you would like to try it, I can serve it in the dining room." "I will eat here," he said. She turned to look at him again. "Here." He met her eyes and held them. "Here," he repeated. In the same tone he said everything quiet, certain, final. Amara set a second bowl on the island. They ate in silence that was not entirely uncomfortable, which was its own kind of problem. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he tasted the soup and did not perform a reaction the way people sometimes did when they tried food from a culture they were unfamiliar with. No exaggerated appreciation, no polite murmuring. He just ate.
Steadily.
Like a man settling into something he intended to do again. "This is good," he said eventually. "Thank you," she said. More silence. He refilled his own bowl. She watched him do it, and something warm and inconvenient moved through her chest. "Tell me about Ghana," he said. She looked at him sharply. He looked back at her with complete composure. "You want to know about Ghana," she said. "I want to know about you." He set his spoon down. "You are from Accra."
"How do you know that?"
He held her gaze. "I have files on all staff. Basic background." He paused. "Yours was more interesting than most." Amara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What does that mean?" "It means you graduated top of your class in hospitality management." He said it quietly. "It means you were accepted to 2 postgraduate programs in London and turned them down to take care of your mother when she became sick. It means you came here because the salary was 3 times what you could earn at home and your brother's tuition is due in February." The kitchen went very quiet.
You had me investigated, she said.
Her voice was steady, because she was good at keeping her voice steady, but her hands had stopped moving on the counter. I investigate everyone who enters this house, he said. It is not personal. Going through my personal history and sitting down to eat soup with me while discussing it feels quite personal, Mr. Choi. Another of those almost smiles. Barely there. Gone before it could be confirmed. He stood up from the stool and picked up his bowl and brought it to the sink and rinsed it himself, which was extraordinary because in the weeks she had been here she had never seen him clean up after himself. He set it in the drying rack and he looked at her and said, "Your brother's tuition. It has been paid." Amara's brain stopped working. "What?" she said. He was already walking toward the kitchen door. "It was handled this morning." His voice was casual, like he was reporting the weather again. "The balance has been cleared. He will receive confirmation from the university by end of day." She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. She caught his arm before he reached the door, and she felt him go very still beneath her hand, felt every muscle in his forearm contract, and she released him immediately, but she stepped in front of him, so he had to either look at her or move around her.
You cannot do that, she said.
Her voice was not steady anymore. You cannot just pay my brother's university fees without asking me. I did not ask for that. I did not give you permission to. He was looking at her mouth. Her words dried up. He looked up to her eyes. You work for me, he said quietly. Your family struggles are a weight you carry into this house every day. It makes you distracted when you think no one is watching. He held her gaze. I removed the weight. That is all. That is not all, she said, and her voice came out rough and furious and also, horribly, something that was not fury at all. You cannot buy your way into my, she stopped herself. She did not finish that sentence because she did not have the right word for what he was trying to buy his way into, and she was not going to name it out loud in this kitchen. He waited. She stepped aside. He walked out. She stood in the kitchen for a very long time with her hand still warm from where it had closed around his arm, and her heartbeat doing things she did not have the discipline to ignore. That night she called her brother. He answered on the first ring, which was unusual. Amara, he said, and his voice was filled with something she had not heard in it in 2 years. Relief. Pure and bright and real. Amara, you will not believe it. Someone paid my entire tuition. I called the university and they said it was cleared this afternoon by a wire transfer and the account name was something I could not read. It was in Korean, and I thought maybe it was an error, but they confirmed it was intentional.
It was not an error, she said. How?
Sis, how did you? A long pause on her end of the line. I will explain later, she said. Just study. Okay? Just study, and do not worry about the money. Focus on school. After she hung up, she sat in the dark of her small room and looked at the photograph of her family on the wall and the Kent cloth draped over her desk chair and the cashmere-lined slippers on her feet, and she thought about a Korean Mafia boss who had cleared her brother's tuition without being asked and delivered heating pads and humidifiers and shea butter, and said that is all in a voice that made it clear it was not all. It was only the beginning, and she thought about the way he had looked at her hands and the way he had looked at her mouth, and the way something cracked inside her chest every time he walked into a room. She was not going to fall for him. She was absolutely not going to fall for him. She lasted for more days before everything broke open. It happened because of Kong Dae-young. He came back to the estate for a second meeting, which told Amara that whatever had happened the last time had not cost him enough to stay away. He arrived on a Friday evening when the estate was quiet. Most of the staff dismissed early for a family day the syndicate apparently practiced monthly. Amara had stayed because her assignment was the boss's personal attendant, and personal attendants did not take family days. She was in the corridor outside the east sitting room when Dae-young found her again. This time there were no open doors. This time Tae-yoon was across the estate in his office, and there were 2 of Dae-young's own men standing at the far end of the corridor looking at the walls with practiced disinterest. The context made her skin crawl. Well, Dae-young said, stopping in front of her with an expression that had decided something in advance. Alone again. Amara looked at him steadily. I have work to do, she said. Tae-yoon cannot keep you forever, you know. He said it conversationally, but his eyes were not conversational. His eyes were calculating. He thinks you are special. But men like us, we get tired of special things. He smiled. I could offer you a better situation. Something more comfortable. Something that does not involve.
Get out of my way, she said.
His hand shot out and closed around her wrist. The grip was not gentle this time. Let go of me, she said, and her voice was completely level because she had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she could not afford, and she was not going to give this man the satisfaction of her fear. She pulled against his grip. He held. And then the sitting room door opened. What happened next happened very fast. Choi Tae-yoon took in the scene in approximately half a second. His eyes went to Dae-young's hand on Amara's wrist. His expression did not change. It simply became very, very still, the way water becomes still before it freezes solid. He crossed the corridor in 4 steps. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a weapon, though she knew from weeks in this house that he was almost always armed. He simply placed his hand on Dae-young's arm and applied pressure to a precise point that she would later understand was a nerve cluster, and Dae-young released her wrist and made a sound that was embarrassingly close to a yelp. Tae-yoon stepped between them. He spoke in Korean. She caught fragments from what she had been picking up in the weeks at the estate. The word for leave. The word for now. Something that sounded like a number, and from Dae-young's expression she understood it was a threat with a timeline attached. Dae-young straightened. He looked at Amara over Tae-yoon's shoulder with an expression that was fury and something uglier beneath it, the expression of a man who had just been humiliated and was already planning where to put that humiliation later. Then he left. Tae-yoon turned to her. He looked at her wrist. She could already see the faint redness where Dae-young had gripped her. He reached out, not asking, and lifted her wrist in both his hands and looked at it with an expression on his face that she had never seen on him before. It was not his normal controlled blankness. It was something raw and controlled, and very tightly leashed. Does it hurt? He said. No, she said. It was not entirely true. His jaw moved. He turned her wrist over gently and examined the redness, and something in his breathing changed, a deepening, a deliberateness, like a man pulling himself back from an edge. He will not come back, he said. She looked at his face. The way you said that, she said carefully. What did you say to him just now? Tae-yoon lowered her wrist, but did not entirely release it. He looked up at her, and his eyes were very dark and very close, and the corridor was very quiet. I told him, he said evenly, that if he entered this estate again, I would send him back to his family in pieces. Amara breathed out slowly. You cannot threaten people like that over a maid, she said. The word fell wrong even as she said it. She knew it was wrong. He knew it was wrong. She could see it in the way his hands tightened fractionally around her wrist before he deliberately relaxed them. You are not a maid, he said. I literally am Mr. Choi. That is literally my job title. You are, he stopped. He looked at her wrist in his hands, and something moved across his face that she had no name for, because she had never seen it on him before. You are not a maid, he said again, quieter. And I do not want you to call yourself that. Then what am I, she said. It came out before she meant it to. Quiet and direct and a little breathless and far too honest for a corridor in a crime lord's estate at 7 o'clock on a Friday evening. He looked up at her. He did not answer, but his thumb moved, just once, across the inside of her wrist. Slow and deliberate and unbearable. She pulled her hand back. She took a step away from him. She needed distance between herself and that look on his face, between herself and the warmth of his hands and the impossible softness of a man everyone in this city was afraid of standing in a quiet corridor being gentle with her wrist. I am going to make dinner, she said. Her voice was almost entirely steady. She walked away. She was shaking and she did not let herself look back to see if he was watching. He was watching. The following week moved strangely. Tae-yoon was present but different, closer in ways that were not physical, but felt physical, the way he tracked her across a room with his eyes, the way conversations that were supposed to be brief stretched into something longer, the way he started arriving in spaces where she was working and finding reasons to stay. He asked her questions. Careful, deliberate questions that accumulated into a portrait. Her favorite color, whether she dreamed in English or her mother tongue, what music her grandmother played in the evenings, whether she had ever been in love. That last one he asked quietly on a Wednesday afternoon while she was folding linens in the upstairs corridor, and she had gone so still he said, You don't have to answer. Once, she said, finally. A long time ago.
She paused.
It did not go well. He did not ask what had happened. He said, simply, his loss, and went back to the file he had been reading, and Amara folded the rest of the linens with her face turned away so he could not see what his answer had done to her expression. On Thursday evening, one of the senior staff pulled her aside. His name was Gubium, and he had worked for the Choi family even longer than Mrs. Park, and he had the eyes of someone who had seen things that had rearranged the order of his priorities permanently. You should be careful, he said, in the low, measured tone of a man who chose his moments. Amara looked at him. The boss, Gubium said. He has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you. Not in the years I have been here.
He paused.
This is not a warning against him. He is not a bad man, not in the way the world imagines. He paused again longer. But there are people around him who watch, who notice, who would use the thing he is most careful about. You mean me, Amara said. He nodded once. She thanked him. She went back to her room that night and sat with the weight of what he had said, the idea that she had become, without meaning to, something that could be used as a weapon against the most dangerous man in Seoul. She should have asked to be reassigned. She should have called the agency and requested a transfer to a different placement. She should have done the practical, sensible, self-protective thing. Instead, she put on her cashmere-lined slippers and picked up the small book she had been reading and told herself she would figure it out tomorrow. She did not figure it out tomorrow. Tomorrow brought a dinner party. The dinner party was not what Amara expected. She had expected syndicate business. She had expected the kind of gathering she had glimpsed edges of in her weeks at the estate, men in expensive suits speaking in careful voices with eyes that were always calculating exits, women who wore their silence as a second accessory alongside their jewelry. She had expected to move through it invisibly, refilling glasses, disappearing into the background, the way good staff always did. What she had not expected was that Choi Tae-yoon would seat her at the table. She discovered this when she arrived in the dining room with a first course and found a place sitting at the main table, between an older woman she had never seen and a man she recognized as one of Tae-yoon's most senior advisors, and Mrs. Park murmured in her ear that the boss had specified the arrangement himself. You're joking, Amara whispered. Mrs. Park did not joke. She had 20 minutes to change, and she did it in 15, pulling out the only dress she owned that was appropriate for a formal dinner, a deep green wrap dress her mother had bought her for graduation dinner 2 years ago. It fit her the way things fit her, close at the hips, generous at the chest, the kind of silhouette that she had spent her 20s learning to be at peace with. She put her hair up because it felt like armor, and she walked back to that dining room with her spine straight and her heartbeat only slightly unsteady. Tae-yoon was standing at the head of the table when she entered. He saw her. She watched him see her. His eyes moved over her the way they moved over everything, methodically, completely, taking inventory. Except when they reached her face, they stayed there, and he did not look away, and something about the steadiness of his attention pulled the breath out of her body. She sat down. He sat at the head. Across a table of 12 people, his eyes found her approximately every 4 minutes for the next 2 hours. She counted because counting gave her something to do with the attention she was not supposed to be paying him. The woman to her left introduced herself as Seo Young-sun. She was in her mid-60s, small and precise, with the kind of energy that suggested she had been the most formidable person in every room she had ever entered. She looked at Amara with eyes that were measuring and not unkind.
So you're the one, she said.
Amara picked up her water glass. The one what? The woman smiled. The one who made him change his breakfast schedule. Amara took a very careful sip. He moved his morning coffee to the kitchen. The woman continued, pleasant and precise as a surgeon. For the first time in 11 years. Because you take your break in the kitchen at 7:15. She tilted her head. He thinks no one noticed. Everyone noticed, Amara said carefully. I suspect. Seo Young-sun laughed. Genuine and warm. He is, she said, not unaffectedly, terribly obvious. For a man who prides himself on opacity. Amara looked down the table and found him watching her again. This time he did not look away when she caught him. She looked away first. After dinner, the guests moved to the main sitting room for drinks, and the kind of conversation that happened in these spaces, careful and layered, and half of it actually about something else entirely. Amara moved to help collect glasses, and Taeyun appeared at her elbow so quietly she startled.
You do not have to do that, he said. I am staff, she said. Not tonight, he said.
She turned to face him, and they were close, closer than they usually stood. The room crowded enough that the space between them had compressed to something intimate, without either of them engineering it. What am I tonight, then? She said, and she had meant to say it with distance, with the professional remove she had been building all these weeks, but it came out soft. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. He opened his mouth. Across the room, a man laughed too loudly at something, and the moment shattered. Someone touched Taeyun's arm to direct his attention to a conversation that apparently required him, and he went, but he looked back at her once. Just once. Like he was noting where she was so he could find her again. She put down the glasses she had collected and went to stand by the window with a glass of water and told herself she was completely in control of the situation. She was absolutely not in control of the situation. The danger arrived 2 weeks later. It arrived in the form of a man named Jo Hyunsik, who was what the syndicate whispered about in the corridors when they thought no one was listening, a rival organization leader who had been patient and calculating for 3 years, waiting for a crack in the Choi Empire through which to insert a lever. He had tried money. He had tried territory. He had tried direct violence twice and lost people both times. He had apparently decided to try something different. Amara was at the market, accompanied by one of the junior security staff, doing the weekly household grocery run, when the black car pulled alongside them at the edge of the market parking lot, and 2 men she did not know stepped out, and the junior security guard was on the ground before she even fully understood what was happening.
She ran.
She was fast when she needed to be, fast and smart about it, cutting through the market stalls and the afternoon crowd, keeping her head down and her movement unpredictable. She dropped her phone into the bag of a passing woman and pressed herself into a doorway and watched the men she was running from sweep past, searching. She waited 4 minutes. Then she walked calmly to the nearest shop with a landline telephone, which was a small stationery store run by an elderly man who looked at her expression and handed her the phone without a word. She called the estate. Mrs. Park answered. Amara said 3 words. I need Taeyun. He was on the line in 40 seconds. She told him quickly and clearly what had happened, the car, the men, the security guard, her location. She spoke the way she had spoken to Dae-young in the corridor with his hand around her wrist, level and deliberate, because panic was still a luxury she could not afford. He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, do not move. Lock the door. I am coming. He came in 16 minutes. Not men he sent. Him. Personally, in a black car with 2 others, getting out before the car fully stopped and covering the distance between the car and the shop doorway in long, fast strides, and when she stepped out he looked at her from her face to her feet and back to her face, and the expression that moved across him was not his usual controlled stillness. It was something older and rawer than that. Something that had not yet been disciplined into smoothness. He put one hand on her face.
Just his palm against her cheek.
Brief and warm and overwhelming.
Are you hurt? He said.
No, she said. His exhale was controlled, but she heard the edges of it. The parts he could not entirely smooth. His men moved around them efficiently. The street was already being swept. The shop owner was being compensated for the use of his phone and the complication to his afternoon. Everything was handled with the quiet efficiency of an organization that had been managing crises for decades. Taeyun kept his hand on her face for exactly 4 seconds. Then he removed it and took a step back, and his expression reassembled into something more familiar. He said, You are coming back to the estate. You will not go to the market again without a full security detail. She should have said she needed to think about the safety implications of her role here. She should have said they needed to discuss whether this job was still sustainable given that someone had now tried to abduct her. She should have said a lot of sensible things. Instead, she said, Okay. He looked at her. Okay. She met his eyes. You came yourself. Of course, he said, and it was so simple, so completely without performance, that it hit her like a fist in the sternum. The ride back to the estate was quiet. He sat beside her in the back seat. Not touching, not talking, but present in a way that was more contact than contact. The warmth of him at her shoulder, the steadiness of his breathing, The way he kept her between himself and the car door so his body was between her and the street. She watched the city pass outside the window and thought about a man who ran a criminal empire and delivered cashmere slippers and paid her brother's tuition and came personally when someone tried to take her. She thought about how none of this was simple, how it had never been simple from the first morning in that bathroom when he had said those words in that quiet, devastating voice. She thought about how she was falling in love with him and how terrible and inevitable that was. That night she knocked on the door of his private study. She had never done this before. She had entered his spaces only when called. She had maintained the line between her world and his with the careful discipline of a person who understood what crossing it might mean. She knocked anyway.
"Come in," he said.
He was at his desk, his jacket off, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to the elbows, and he looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who recognized immediately that something was different about this visit. She closed the door behind her. She said, "I want to say something and I need you to just listen and not interrupt me." He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands and said nothing, which was his way of consenting. She stood in the middle of his study with the fire and the hearth behind her, and she said, "I know what I am here. I know what this arrangement is. I know that you are who you are, and I am who I am, and I know that people like me do not end up in the story with people like you in any way that does not eventually hurt the person with less power."
She paused. She breathed.
"And I know you have been kind to me. I know the things you have done, the slippers and the tuition and Daeyoung and today. I know all of that." She met his eyes, and they were very dark and very still across the firelit room. "And I know that it means something to you, the way it means something to me. And I am standing here telling you that because today, when someone tried to take me, the first thing I thought was that I needed you. And I do not want to lie about that to myself anymore." The room was so quiet she could hear the fire. Taeyoon rose from his desk. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, and she had to tilt her chin up slightly to hold his gaze, and he looked at her with an expression that had nothing left of its usual control, nothing managed or disciplined about it. Just something open and irreversible and entirely directed at her. He raised his hand and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed the curve of her jaw, and he left them there. "I should tell you to leave," he said. His voice was very quiet. He was not telling her to leave. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I am not a safe man." His thumb moved along her jaw. "I have enemies."
"You know that now."
"What happened today, it was because of who I am." He looked at her steadily. "If you stay, that danger stays." She leaned into his hand by approximately half an inch, which was not much, and was everything. "I grew up in a city where power was always someone else's," she said. "Where safety was always conditional." She held his eyes. "I know what danger looks like. I know what it does not look like." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I have wanted to tell you something for weeks." "Tell me," she said. "You are the most extraordinary person who has ever walked into this house," he said. "And I have been trying to be careful with you, because you deserve careful." He breathed in. "And I do not want to be careful anymore." The words landed in the space between them like light. She lifted her hand and placed it over his, the one still warm against her jaw, and she held it there. The fire crackled. The city moved outside the windows. The world with its wars and empires and criminal hierarchies continued, entirely indifferent to the two people standing in a private study in the hills above Gangnam, choosing each other as carefully and completely as choosing a direction to walk in the dark. He lowered his head. She lifted her face. And the distance between them, the distance she had been maintaining for weeks with discipline and self-deception and cashmere slippers, collapsed. He kissed her like a man who had been patient long past the point of patience and was finally done being careful. She kissed him back like a woman who had been afraid of this exact thing for weeks and had finally decided that some things were worth being afraid of. The fire burned low and the study filled with quiet, and somewhere in the city below them Choi Tae-yoon's enemies were counting the cracks in his empire and finding, for the first time, one they thought they could use. They were wrong, but they did not know that yet. Amara discovered the photograph by accident. It was 3 days after the study. 3 days of a different kind of closeness, meals together that no longer pretended to be anything except what they were. Evenings in the sitting room where he read and she read, and the silence between them was no longer neutral, but saturated with something warm. He still did not perform affection publicly, not in front of the staff, not in front of the men who moved through his estate on business. But she would find his hand at the small of her back in empty corridors. She would look up from her book to find him watching her. She would wake in the morning to a text on her phone, one line, always in Korean that she was slowly learning to read, that said things like today is less difficult than yesterday, and I am glad you are here. The photograph was on his desk, turned face down, and she only saw it because she was cleaning the study when he was away, and she turned it over automatically to clean beneath it. A woman.
Korean.
Beautiful in a careful, quiet way. Young, early 20s perhaps. Standing in a garden Amara did not recognize with an expression that was happy in the uncomplicated way of someone who does not know yet that unhappiness is coming. She turned it back over, set it carefully back in its position. Finished cleaning. Left. She did not ask him about it that evening. She asked him about it 2 evenings later because it had been sitting in her chest like a stone, and she had decided she was done pretending stones were not stones. They were in the sitting room. She put her book down and she said, "The photograph on your desk."
Who is she?
He did not pretend not to know what she meant. He set his own reading aside. He looked at the fire for a moment.
Her name was Yeonji, he said.
She was my fiancée. Amara's heart did something complicated.
Was, she said. She died, he said.
6 years ago. His voice did not crack. It was measured and honest, and the absence of theatrics made it more devastating than theatrics would have been. There was an accident. Our car. I walked away. She did not. She looked at his face in the firelight. He was not looking at her. He was looking at somewhere else. I kept the photograph, he said, because I wanted to remember what it looked like before I understood what I could cost the people around me. He paused. I kept the photograph because I needed to remember to stay back from people, to not become the kind of danger to them that I was to her.
He looked at her then.
She held his gaze and did not flinch. And yet here I am, she said softly. He breathed in.
Here you are, he said.
The silence was thick and warm and honest.
I am not Yeonji, she said.
I am not going to break the same way. He crossed the room. He sat beside her, and his hand found hers, and he turned it over and held it the way he had held her wrist in the corridor, careful and complete, like something precious that he was aware was breakable and had decided to hold anyway.
I know that, he said.
He looked at her hand in his. I am afraid that what I am will break you in ways you cannot anticipate. He looked up. And I am more afraid of losing you than of the risk. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. We are both afraid, she said. Let us be afraid together. The threat that had been building in the background of their world arrived on a Thursday in the form of intelligence that one of Taeyoon's lieutenants, a man named Woo Sang-cheol, who had been with the syndicate for 8 years, was feeding information to Jo Hyun-sik. Information including the layout of the estate, including staff schedules, including, Taeyoon told her with a controlled fury that was more frightening than any raised voice could have been, including the fact that she had become important to him.
They used you as bait, he said.
The market. That was not random. Someone told them where you would be, and when. Amara sat with this. The weight of it. The idea that her presence in this house had been turned into a weapon and aimed at the man sitting across from her. Woo Sang-cheol has been removed, Taeyoon said. He said it the way he said everything, quiet and final, and she chose not to ask what removed meant because she understood enough about his world now to understand that some questions had answers she was not equipped to carry. Jo Hyun-sik has been warned, he continued. But warnings without consequences teach nothing. He looked at her. There will be a response. Amara looked at him steadily. Are you telling me this because you want me to understand what you do? I am telling you, he said, because you deserve to know everything about the world you are choosing. He met her eyes. I will not hide my life from you, even the parts that are difficult. She thought about Gyu-bium's warning in the corridor weeks ago, about being used, about the cost of being important to a powerful man. She thought about the market, the black car, his hand on her face when he came. She thought about a woman named Yeonji and a man who had spent 6 years keeping the world at arm's length because he was afraid of what he could cost it. She thought about all of it, and she said, Tell me what you need. His expression broke open just slightly. Just enough. The response to Jo Hyun-sik took 4 days, and was not something Amara witnessed directly, but felt in the changed atmosphere of the estate, the sharpened alertness of the security, the phone calls Taeyoon took in closed rooms, the way he checked on her 3 and 4 times a day in brief, quiet visits that lasted only minutes, but always included his hand on her arm or her shoulder or her cheek. Quick and deliberate, like touching something he needed to confirm was still there. On the 4th evening, he came to find her in the kitchen where she was making groundnut soup again, and he sat on his stool at the island and said, "It is handled." She nodded. She stirred the soup. Jo Hyun-sik has agreed to terms that will hold, he said.
He paused.
You are no longer a target. She looked at him. Is it because of me that you agreed to terms instead of? Yes, he said simply. She put the spoon down.
Taeyoon.
I would have handled it differently before, he said. His eyes were steady on hers.
Before you.
He said it without apology or performance. Just fact. I would have chosen destruction. Now, I am choosing differently. She crossed to the island. She stood in front of him. She put her hand on his face the way he put his hand on hers, and he went very still under her touch, and she held it there and looked at him and said, I am not going to tell you what kind of man to be, but I am glad you are choosing. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds. His jaw moved under her palm. When he opened them again, he said, I want to ask you something. His voice was different. Lower. More careful in a new way. Ask, she said.
I want you to stay, he said.
Not as staff. He looked at her with everything open and unguarded in a way she suspected almost no one had ever seen from him. Not as anything temporary. As mine. He paused. I want the right to protect you permanently. To build something with you. To not have to watch you walk out of this house and wonder if this is the day I lose you too.
She breathed.
She thought about Accra, about her mother and her brother, and a small room in a staff wing with a photograph of her family on the wall. She thought about everything that separated her world from his. The ocean between them. The blood and empire and danger that lined his hallways. The cashmere slippers and the tuition and a man who came personally because she needed him. She thought about how love was not supposed to make sense to the rational mind. It was supposed to make sense to the part of you that was not rational at all. The part that recognized something and held on.
Yes, she said.
His exhale was quiet and deep and everything. He reached into his shirt pocket and he produced something she had not been expecting. A ring, not ostentatious, not a display of wealth for its own sake, a slim gold band with a single dark stone, dark as his eyes, warm as his hands.
This was my grandmother's, he said.
She was the most honest person I ever knew. He held it between them. I have been carrying it for a week because I could not find the right moment. He looked at her. There is no right moment. There is only now. She gave him her hand. He slid it on. The kitchen smelled like groundnut soup and cedarwood and everything beginning, and outside the windows of the estate the city of Seoul pulsed bright and indifferent and beautiful, and inside, in a small kitchen that had become the most important room in a powerful man's fortress, 2 people sat together in the quiet and chose each other fully and finally. They married in the spring. Not with syndicate fanfare. Not with the kind of event that made headlines and required security details and photographers. They married in a small ceremony in a garden that Amara would later realize was the same garden in the photograph on his desk, Yeonji's garden, which she understood was his way of bringing every part of his life together, the grief and the healing and the future all standing in the same place. Seo Young-sun attended and wept and said she had been waiting for this since the evening she saw him watching Amara across the dinner table. Mrs. Park attended in her best hanbok and looked satisfied in the way of a woman whose understanding of the household had been confirmed. Gubium stood in the back and nodded once when he caught Amara's eye across the garden, a nod that said, I told you, he was not a bad man. I was right to tell you to be careful, and I am glad you were careful enough to stay. Amara's mother flew in from Accra. She met Choi Tae-yoon in the garden on the morning of the wedding, and she looked him over for a long silent moment, and she said, in English that was crisp and absolute, if you hurt her, God will not be able to help you. Tae-yoon looked at her with complete seriousness and said, if I hurt her, I will not require God's assistance. I will handle it myself. Her mother blinked. Then she laughed, genuine and loud, And she patted his arm and said, "Good," and walked away, and Amara, standing close enough to hear all of it, pressed her lips together and looked at the sky. Her brother flew in from London, tan from a summer term and taller than she remembered, and he shook Taeyun's hand and then pulled him close and said something in his ear that made Taeyun's mouth curve into a real smile, wide and rare and devastating, and Amara spent the next hour trying to get her brother to tell her what he had said. He never did. The day itself was golden and warm and smelled like cherry blossoms and her grandmother's folk songs because Amara sang one, quietly, to herself, while she stood in the garden waiting, and she did not hear him approach until his hands settled at her waist, and his voice was warm against her temple.
"You are singing," he said.
She leaned back into him. "You always find me when I sing." "I always will," he said. 6 months later, in the bedroom of an estate that had stopped being a fortress and started being a home, Amara sat at the edge of the bed with a small white object in her hand and stared at it for a very long time. Then she went to find her husband. He was in the study, jacket off, files spread across his desk, phone pressed to his ear, the particular expression on his face that meant the conversation was complicated and the other party was trying his patience. He looked up when she entered. He looked at her face. He said something brief into the phone and ended the call. He stood up. She held up the object.
He looked at it.
His expression moved through something she could only describe as tectonic, a slow, vast shifting of something fundamental. He crossed the desk in 2 steps. He took the object from her hand.
He looked at it.
Then he looked at her. His eyes were bright. "Taeyun," she said softly, "you are not going to cry." "I am not crying," he said. He was absolutely crying. He pulled her against him and held her with both arms, the object still in one hand, and she felt his chest move against her cheek, and she felt the steadiness of his heartbeat, that particular heartbeat she had memorized over months of standing close to him in kitchens and corridors and studies and gardens. She thought about a Tuesday morning and a bathroom full of steam and words spoken in a quiet voice that had cracked something open in her chest that had never closed again. She thought about slippers and tuition and a man who came himself when she needed him. She thought about gold rings and gardens and her mother saying God will not be able to help you. She thought about fear and danger and choosing anyway. She thought about love that did not make sense to the rational mind and made complete sense to everything else. She held her husband and let herself be held. Outside the windows of the estate, the city of Seoul moved and breathed and pulsed with light, indifferent to everything that was not its own survival, the way cities always were. But inside, in a room lined with books and firelight and the quiet evidence of a life being built deliberately from something that had once only been power and grief and distance, something new was beginning. Something small and stubborn and brave, the way all real things were, the way love always was in the end. This is where their story finds its fullness. Not in the danger they survived or the empires they navigated or the enemies they outlasted. In a study in the hills above Gangnam. In a man learning, slowly and carefully, and with great effort, how to be soft. In a woman who sang when she cleaned and wore cashmere slippers to bed and never let fear be the last word. In a child on the way who would be, someday, told about a bathroom and a question and a Tuesday morning that changed everything. And the story would be told the way all good stories were told, with wonder and with warmth and with a quiet, unshakable certainty that some things in this world were worth every difficult step it took to reach them.